President of YouGov. Peter, great to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Wilfred.
I guess the first question is whether Partygate itself is still a damaging issue for the Prime Minister and the Conservatives across the country for voters versus, of course, the focus that has been on what it meant for how the members of the Conservative MPs were thinking about their leader.
Yeah, if you look at the polling, Wilfred, Boris Johnson is now plainly a liability. His rating as Prime Minister is pretty catastrophic. You have to go back to people like John Major in the mid-90s or Gordon Brown about 15 years ago to get Prime Ministers in equivalent trouble with the public. And there are two things worth remembering about John Major and Gordon Brown. Both were thrown out by the electorate, but neither was thrown out by their own party. In both cases, there was attempts to manoeuvre against him by people around him, but both John Major and Gordon Brown survived. So if you take that historic precedent, we shouldn't be terribly surprised if Boris Johnson, terrible though his public ratings are, survives within the Conservative Party.
And talk us through the sort of broad polls, national polls we're seeing, also the polls for those upcoming by-elections that I mentioned, and the significance of those local election results. Clearly, they weren't good for the Conservatives, but is it wrong to try and extrapolate too much from them?
Right, the local elections, Wilfred, they showed Labour broadly over the country as a whole, narrowly, but only narrowly, ahead of the Conservatives. Now, all history of mid-term local elections says that governments recover as the following election approaches. So if history repeats itself, and it's one of the reasons why Boris Johnson, I think, is feeling a bit chipper at the moment, if history repeats itself, the Conservatives could well come back and win the next election. The question really is this mid-term different? You know, we've got the cost of living crisis. We've got predictions of the economy stalling over the next couple of years as the next election approaches. So the hope for the Conservatives is that history repeats itself. The fear is that this time it's different. And, you know, I wouldn't put too much money either way.
Let's touch on the significance of the cost of living crisis. Clearly, the next general election could be more than 2 years away, and so much can happen between now and then. But in a hypothetical situation where the economy worsens, perhaps is bad enough to take us into recession, and the economy is still struggling by the time of the next general election, what does history tell us about the scale to which an incumbent government gets punished for that?
It can get punished. Wilfred, the phrase that comes to my mind is not from Britain, but when Ronald Reagan stood for president in the States in 1980 against the incumbent Jimmy Carter. And Ronald Reagan's killer question to the public was, do you feel better off than you were 4 years ago when Carter became president? And the American public said no, and they elected Reagan and threw out Carter. So I think it's quite possible, and this is why this midterm could be different, that in the next election, the fact that we've had the inflation running ahead of incomes, but after what will then be 15 years of austerity and living standards which have not moved forward. So I think a lot of people will feel hard done by. It may not be, in fact, I would say it isn't on the whole the government's fault, the short-term problem, which comes from abroad. But, you know, governments take credit for things where they're lucky and they get blamed when they're unlucky. And this government at the moment, in terms of cost of living, is unlucky and may well be blamed.
Maybe Keir Starmer should take note of that campaign slogan from Ronald Reagan that you just mentioned. On the note of Keir Starmer, which of the two parties would benefit more from a leadership change at the moment? There's lots of factors at play as to how that could materialise, but is he doing a good job?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, Wilfred, it's very hard to say because it's not clear in either case who would succeed. If we were having this discussion in January about Boris Johnson, you'd say if Boris Johnson wins tomorrow, Rishi Sunak would become Prime Minister, and all the polls at that point showed that Rishi Sunak was a vote winner. That's no longer the case for reasons we don't need to go into. They're pretty clear, both in terms of his personal and family circumstances and what's happened to the British economy. So it's not at all clear who, if anybody, would do better than Boris Johnson, even though he's a liability. And it's one reason why I think a lot of Tory MPs at the moment are reluctant to move against him. But on the Labour side, again, if Keir Starmer was forced to carry out his promise to quit if he gets fined by the Durham police over Beergate or whatever you call it, Cormagate, who would take over? Angela Rayner probably not, because she was also at that event and might also get fined, so she's out of it. Then you look at Yvette Cooper. Some people are talking about Andy Burnham, Wes Streeting. None of them, it's clear, there's no clarity from the polling on any of them that they would do a lot better than Keir Starmer. So we're walking into the unknown in both parties.
And then just finally, Peter, the two upcoming by-elections, does the Conservative Party hold on?
I think the political market has written them off. They expect the Conservatives to lose Wakefield to Labour and Tiverton to the Liberal Democrats. Bizarrely, even if there are big swings, if the Conservatives hold on to even one of them, it will be better than expectations. And it's one of those cases where expectations matter as much as the result. If Labour win Wakefield big, if the Liberal Democrats win Tiverton big, that will be a problem for Boris Johnson. Whether it'll be enough to get rid of him, I don't know. But the fact that that we're talking as if it's expected the Conservatives will lose does underline the trouble the Conservatives are in, whether they keep Boris Johnson or not.